everyone, how's it going? It's Vasco from the Angular University. In this lesson we are going to set up the Angular 2 router and we are going to avoid a couple of huge pitfalls from the beginning to give you an optimal Angular 2 router learning experience. It's coming right up. When setting up the router, the first thing that you want to define is your base path. You can do that using the HTML5 based HTML tag, and you should point it to the entry point of your application. So in this case, we are pointing to this particular folder. Most of the cases you will have a base of /, meaning it's the entry point of the server. When configuring the router, what we are doing is, depending on how the URL changes, certain sections of the page will display a certain content. We call those sections outlets. We are going to define here the primary outlet of the Angular 2 router. This means that in this section of the page, the content of this tag will be replaced by a certain component depending on the state of the URL. Which sections of the page correspond to which URLs? That's where the router configuration comes in. Let's set up our router configuration, so it's just an array of route objects and each one must define a path. So in this case, we want a certain component to display when we navigate to home, and we are going to display the home component. In order to be able to use the router, the first thing that we need to do is to set it up in our application, because it's not included by default in Angular. So in order to do so, we need to go to the root module of our application, the app module, and we need to import the router module. But we should not simply import it. We should call this method forRoot and pass it in the router configuration. We are going to understand why this forRoot method is necessary in our lazy loading and shared modules lesson. Right now, this is the configuration that we need to get things started. If we now try to access the root URL of our application, we're going to get an error, but this is normal because we only configure the path to home, not a path to the root folder. So we would think that if we add home to the URL and we hit refresh to reload the application, that this would work. But we get a different error. We get a 404 not found from the server. This is a very common situation for someone just starting with the router, and it's the main pitfall that we mentioned in the beginning of this lesson. How to fix this and what's going on exactly here. So what's going on is that when we modify the URL and we hit enter, we are actually triggering a full page reload from the server, so we are not modifying the URL using the history API. When we modify the URL manually and we hit enter, this is going to trigger a request to the server to load a file named home without an extension. This file does not exist, so we get back a 404. To avoid this problem, what we need to do is to configure our server so that any unmatched request will return the index.html file that contains our single page application. So /home should returns us as the HTTP response the index.html file. Then Angular will bootstrap itself, the router will kick in, inspect the URL and take us to the home path. Let's apply this logic to our concrete case of our Node.js Express server. So we simply need to create an Express middleware that redirects us to the index.html file if the request was not matched by any of the previous routes that we configured. We will see in a second a better way of doing this, but let's try this out. So if we type in here an unmatched path, we get redirected to index.html, and this file contains our single page application. Our application kicks in and Angular takes over from there. But this situation is not ideal because we created a redirect. There's a better way, which is to configure the server to do, instead of a redirect, to return directly the index.html file. So if we do that in Express using response.sendFile, we are going to get back directly index.html, which is our single page application. Angular 2 kicks in, the router kicks in and notices I should be displaying /home. So it's going to look up the router configuration to see which component corresponds to /home, and it's going to display the home component. I really advise you to configure your server this way from the beginning in order to get a good development experience with the router. Otherwise you will just get 404 all the time. Now, one last trick, which is we can enable debug information in the router. We do that via the enable tracing property. And with this you are all set up to further explore the router. We are going to explore child routes, auxiliary routes, and we are going to explain why does that contribute for a much better user experience and allows to more easily build much more modern and dynamic applications. So let's continue our deep dive in the router. Next up, router navigation. Hello everybody and welcome! It's Vasco here from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to learn about the routerLink directive, learn a couple of different ways to use it, there's more than one, and we're going to see how it can actually be applied to different elements on the page, not only links. It's coming right up. To start, let's configure a few more routes in our application. By the way, our application is a small e-learning system where we will have a list of courses, we click on it, we can see the lessons, so it's a small e-learning platform. In this section of the router, we are just simply going to focus on the routing, but in an upcoming section, we are going to build the whole application, including the backend. We're going to use Firebase. So let's get started. Let's first configure a couple of extra routes. We are going to configure, besides the home route, we're going to configure the courses route, we're going to show the courses component, and the lessons route, where we're going to show the all lessons component. Let's give this configuration a quick try. So if we type in the URL home, we get displayed the home component. Now let's try it with courses. This is the courses component containing just a list of courses. And this is the lessons route, where we have a list of all the lessons available. This confirms that the routing configuration is working. Now what we want to do is to create a top menu where we can click in one entry and navigate directly to that section. So let's do that using the routerLink directive. Let's start by applying routerLink to an anchor tag. So we can apply it by simply passing the path to which we want to navigate. The Angular 2 router path, that is. So the directive will cancel the navigation that is associated to a normal anchor HTML element, and it will instead trigger the router. Let's configure another menu entry like this, and let's show another way of using routerLink. You can also pass it in an expression. You are not forced to pass it a string, so if you pass it an expression, you should pass it an array containing the different paths to which you want to navigate. In this case, we want to navigate to the lessons path. The routerLink directive is not only meant for anchor elements, you can apply it actually to any element on the page. So let's apply it to the home icon. What happens here is that the click on the element will be detected, and in response to the click, the route will be triggered. Notice here that in this component we have included in its directives array the router directives. Without this, routerLink will not work. Also, any other routing directive would not work without this. So this is already a good start. You have an application, you have a couple of routes configured, you have a menu. What you want to do from the beginning in an application is to configure a fallback route and also a default home route. We're going to see how to do this in the upcoming lesson. Hello everyone and welcome! Vasco here from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to learn how to set up an index route and a fallback route for our application and why that is important. It's coming right up. So let's start with the index route. Whenever you go to the root of your application, you probably want to display something to the user. But with our current configuration, that is not the case, because the root route or the index route does not get associated, or it's not matched with any of the routes that we have currently configured. So let's add some configuration to it. Let's add it an index route, and we are going to give it an empty path. We are also going to give it the home component. In an upcoming lesson, we are going to see how we could have done this in another way. Let's try this out. So if we access the root URL of our application, we get displayed the home component, which is the expected behavior. Now, what happens if we type some other URL that is not mapped to any route? What is the current behavior? What happens is that we get an error in the console saying that we could not find a match for this URL in the route configuration. If we want a better user experience, we can redirect the user to, for example, the home component. For that, we need to configure a fallback route. So let's do that. The path of the fallback route is the double star wildcard, and this is going to match all URLs. We're going to give it for the moment the all lessons component. Let's try this out. If we now type an unknown URL, we should be redirected to the all lessons component, and that is the case. Let's now just make the fallback component the home component instead of all lessons. Now, what you might not have noticed before is that in the routing configuration, the order matters. The order is very important. So let's say that, for example, we take the fallback route and we put it as the first item in our configuration. Let's try this out. If we now click around the same links that were working before, we can see that everything is being redirected to the home component. That's because the routes are searched for a match in the order in which they are defined, and so the first match is always the fallback route. So make sure that you always put the fallback route as the last entry in your configuration. And so our routing configuration is now at a good starting point. You might have noticed that when we click around the top menu, that the current menu gets highlighted in red. How did we do that? That's what we're going to find out in the next lesson. Hello everyone and welcome! This is Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to learn about Angular 2 child routes as part of our router course. So let's get started. Child routes allow us to navigate deeper into our application. The key thing to realize about child routes is that only one child route can be active at a time. And this might sound familiar to you. Take a look at these three top-level routes, so home, courses and lessons. Also, these three routes are only active one at a time. So we could also see our application as having one main entry route, let's say the empty path route, and that empty route has three child routes. Each can only be active once at a time, so this would be an alternative way of configuring our application. Let's try this new configuration. So as you can see, the application still works exactly as before. Let's now give a more common example of the use of a child route. Let's say, for example, the route courses. Typically we would want a child route of it to show the details of a given course. So in the URL we would type /courses/1 or 2, so we would type the ID of the course, something that uniquely identifies the course. Let's configure this. We can actually configure something similar to this scenario even without using child routes. So let's, for example, configure a route course. Notice that it's course and not courses. Course/:ID. And then we map it to course detail, to the course detail component. Let's try this out. If we now type /course/ and then a number, let's say that's the ID of a course, we can see that the course detail component is being displayed to the user. Another way of doing this configuration is via the use of child routes. So under the path courses, we typically have the root path where we have the list of courses, and then we have a child route with the detail of each course. Well, we only want either the summary route or the detail route to be active at each time, and never both. So this is the ideal scenario for using a child route. For this, let's make courses a componentless route. This means that the route is there for routing matching purposes, but the route itself does not instantiate a component. Now we are going to configure two child routes for the courses route. The empty path route, which corresponds to the courses component, the component that shows the list of courses, and the path with the ID of the course. This corresponds to the course detail. Again, only one of these two will be active at a given time. Let's try this out. If we reload the application and go to the path courses, we still have the courses list being loaded as expected. And now if we type manually in the URL courses / and then we give it an ID, we are going to be forwarded to the course detail route, like we expected. You might have noticed that this file is starting to contain a lot of routing configuration, so it's a best practice to split the routing configuration across multiple files. So let's create a new routing configuration file, courses router config, and we are going to copy it in the definition of all the routes that relate to courses. We are then going to import it in the main configuration file, and we are going to include it by using the array spread operator. We are getting deeper into routing, and this is only the beginning. So be sure to watch the following lessons for learning what is an auxiliary route. And we're going to do an exercise at the end of the course where we're going to build a complete dashboard. So stay tuned for the upcoming lessons. How's it going? It's Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to explain in detail auxiliary routes in the Angular 2 router. It's coming right up. So first of all, what is the use case for auxiliary routes? Let's give an example. For example, we go here to the courses screen. We would like, when the user clicks in an item in the courses list, we would like a playlist to be displayed here in the right hand side of the page. This playlist is a section of the page that might contain different content depending on where we navigate in the application. Now, we could definitely add the playlist as a component inside the courses component, right? That would be a solution, but imagine that this section of the page will always be filled in with a certain playlist no matter where you navigate in the application. So here in the courses screen, it's showing the playlist of lessons of a given course, but in the lessons route, it might display something else. So the lessons route contains a list of the latest lessons. Well, the playlist might display in that case the list of the most frequently viewed lessons. In other words, we want this section of the page to behave like if it was a mini browser window with its own navigation URL separate from the main URL, so that when you go back and forth to a given route, we can match it to a different component. If you find yourself in this situation where you have multiple regions of the page that you want them to react differently to the URL, let's say dialog boxes for editing forms, or the left side menu that you want to adjust each time that you navigate. This is a good case for an auxiliary route. Okay, so then let's configure a route, an auxiliary route for the playlist. So we are going to use the playlist path, and when that path is routed to, we are going to associate it to the playlist component. Now we are going to mark this as an auxiliary route by filling in the outlet attribute. We're going to call this outlet playlist. Now, to which section of the page does this outlet correspond to? We're going to configure that by adding a second router outlet tag to the page with the name playlist. So the only difference between an auxiliary route and the standard primary route is that it must have a name. The default route does not have a name by definition, and it has its own separate outlet, which specifies the section on the page to which the routing is going to be applied. Well, you must be thinking, then how do we access this route using just the URL? Let's find out. So if we access this page, we are going to see that there is nothing in the playlist section because we have not routed to it. In our URL, we only specify that we want the primary route to display the home component, but we did not mention anything about the secondary route. And how could we do that? Because after all, there is only one URL in the browser window, right? How can we specify the second URL of the auxiliary route? Angular provides a special syntax for that. So here inside parentheses, we are going to say first which outlet we want to route to. We're going to say it's the playlist outlet. Now we add a colon, and after that we are going to add the URL of that outlet to which we want to route to. And it's as simple as that. If we try this out now, we can see that the playlist is being displayed as expected. Let's give another example. Let's say that when we are routing to the playlist path inside the playlist outlet, we want to display, let's say, completely different component, the courses component. Let's try this out. If we now navigate to playlist-path inside the playlist outlet, we're going to see again the courses component. So this shows that this outlet really has its own separate routing configuration, where there is a separate URL. One key thing to understand about auxiliary routes is that they are just plain routes, so they have all the properties of a standard primary route. You can define child routes, etc. You can nest them one inside the other. It's really like you have a different section of the page with a completely separate URL to which you can provide a completely different routing configuration. We are going to go deeper in this course in auxiliary routes. This is just the beginning. Actually, in the end of this course, we are going to use auxiliary routes extensively to build a dashboard with multiple auxiliary routes. Next up, we are going to see auxiliary route parameters. Hello everyone, how's it going? It's Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to learn about one of the most useful features of the Angular 2 router, lazy loading. It's coming right up. So what is lazy loading and why is it useful? Imagine this situation. You have an application that grows in size over time. You will eventually get to a size in your application where your startup time takes a long time, and that causes a user experience issue. When your application grows beyond a certain scale, what you want to do is you want to split it up into multiple chunks so that not everything needs to be loaded at once at startup time. Take for example this small application. Imagine that it's a very large application actually. For example, we would only want to load the courses functionality if the user clicks for the first time on the courses menu. Like that, we don't have to serve all the functionality related to courses at application startup. This would reduce the application startup time and it would improve the user experience. Let's give a concrete example. Let's extract the courses functionality and put it in a lazy loaded module, and let's see what that means in practice at runtime. So you can see here that the root module of our application, the application module, is importing the courses module. Let's take a look at this module. So it contains all the courses related functionality, such as the courses, courses list, and course detail component. And we can see that the common module is being imported. So this is a normal feature module that is being loaded together with the rest of the application. So what we are going to do now is we are going to configure the router to lazy load this module, the courses module. So the first thing that we need to do is to remove the import of the common module from our application root module. This way there is no reference between our application and this common module. The second step for making a module lazy loaded is to configure the router to do so. So we need to go here to the router configuration and we need to remove all the routing configuration that relates to courses. In place of this configuration, we are simply going to configure the following. If any URL starting with courses is hit, we are going to load this module, and via the property load children, we are going to point to the courses module file. Next, we want to take the routing configuration which is specific of courses, and for the moment we are going to define it in a route config variable inside the courses module file. What we want to do also is to take any services or any injectables that were specific of the courses functionality and will only be used by the courses functionality. We want to take them out of the providers of the root module and we want to move it to the providers of the courses module. Be sure to see the next lesson on shared modules and lazy loading, because this will not always be the way that you want to do this. But these two route guards are specific of the courses functionality, so it's okay to put them here in the courses module. So there we have it, we have everything set up. So let's see lazy loading in action. Let's try this out. So if we now load the application, only the functionality related to home and lessons to these two menu options was loaded. If we now hit the courses menu, we are going to trigger the lazy loading of the courses module. So let's inspect the network tab and see this in action. As you can see, only when we click courses is the courses module loaded, and then the components of the courses module follow. But we can also see here that there is an error in the console. Let's inspect it. So we have here the error message cannot find default in the lazy loaded module. So what is the cause of this? Remember when we configured this module to be lazy loaded via load children, we only defined the name of a file, but a file might have multiple exports. There could be multiple constants, classes, etc. defined as exports in the same file. So this error means that the file was found and it was loaded, but we don't know which export of this file to take into consideration. To fix this, we need to mark the courses module with the default keyword. This will make it the default export of this file. So let's now try this out to see if it's working. If we try this out, we can see that we get a different error. Here what happens is that the courses module functionality does not know the routerLink directive. So even though we have imported the routing directives in our application module, this does not mean that a module that gets imported by the application module also knows the same set of directives. That's why, for example, we had to import common module inside the courses module to recognize standard directives. So this means that we also need to import the routing directives inside the courses module. Also, we need to pass in the routing configuration for the courses functionality. You notice that the variable is still unused. So in order to do both of these things, we are going to call router module for child, and inside we are going to pass in the routing configuration for the courses functionality. What for child will do is that it will add this configuration to the already existing application configuration without overwriting it. If we now try this out, we are going to run into a different issue. Let's take a look at the error message. It says if lessons list is a web component, etc. So this means that lessons list is not known inside the courses module as a component, because we have not added it to its declarations. Let's now do that and see what happens. If we now try this out, we can see that we get another error, and this time the error says type lessons list is part of declaration in two modules. This is because we have added lessons list both to the root application module and to the courses feature module, and one component can only belong to one module. So how can we solve this? What we need is a shared module that contains components that are used by multiple modules of the application. To fix this last problem with lazy loading setup, we need to start by removing lessons list from both the application module and the courses module. We are going to create a new module, shared module. We're going to do that in a separate file. We're going to simply annotate it also with ng module. The shared module is simply a feature module like we saw before that contains one component, lessons list. In order to use it, we need to import it both in our application root module and in our courses module, which is lazy loaded. We now have everything in place for lazy loading to work, so let's see it in action. If we refresh the application and we now hit the courses menu, we can see that the courses module and all its components are being correctly lazy loaded. Let's confirm that everything is working correctly using the DevTools. So if we inspect the network tab, we can see that the courses module is only lazy loaded when we click on the courses menu. and also we have no errors on the console. And so here we have it, lazy loading in action. There is one final pitfall that concerns shared modules and the declaration of services inside them and lazy loading in general, and we are going to cover that in the next lesson.